Okay, well, first of all, I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you for that. It's always nice to have an audience and not just show up on your own to a Zoom. The genesis of this, like a lot of things, was a conversation on Facebook, actually, about the Butturini book. The PhotoBath group has a Facebook group, which is a reasonably active group, 300 or 400 people. And it led to a request by Daz if I'd actually put something together to kind of lead a conversation on it, a discussion on it. Now, for those of you that don't know, my background is I'm a long-term business person, but I'm actually also a visiting professor in the ethics department at University of Leeds. And normally I do data ethics, so recently it's been photographic ethics, which is more interesting to me. And as you just heard, I finished a master's with GEM at Falmouth University about 6 months ago in photography, which we managed to get through okay. I also have a master's in change management on the business side. So I sort of touch on both, on 2 or 3 different angles. So what I've got here is, I got some slides, and what I'm going to do is break it up into, hi Bobby, I'm going to break it up into sections. And then if you've got something you want to ask, if you can just hold it to the end of that section, and we'll see how we go. And if not, we'll change the way of doing it. So I've got like an opening section, middle section, so on. So we'll do it section by section, if that's okay. But of course, if there's anything that you really want to sort of say it. Either put up your hand or get Daz to unmute you or something. I don't tend to watch the chat box. I'm sorry, while I'm trying to talk. I'm too busy trying to manage screens. So, but something interactive would be good. Now, as I understand it from Daz, there's no time limit on this thing, but as Mark knows, I can talk too much. So we are going to try to limit this and not make it too long-winded. I've got slides probably worth about half an hour's worth of stuff, something like that. Yeah, does that all make sense? Okay, so let me see if I can share the screen first of all. Right, can you see the screen? Can everybody see the screen? Yeah, wave at me. I'll just move my camera.
Yes, I can see the screen.
I can look at the screen.
Yes, I can see the screen.
Okay, let me just make this full screen. That should now be full screen, is that right? Yeah. Okay, so I've explained the genesis of this conversation, but I actually want to start by really going backwards. This is the book, by the way, if anybody hasn't seen it. This is the offending article. I got involved in this, I should have said, by the way, before the current controversy. When it came up a year and a quarter ago, I was deep in the master's degree, and this came up as a subject, and I ended up writing about it there and then because I'm very interested in the ethics of photography. So I had a blog, which is on my website, which I've updated now with the latest Parr news, which kind of gives my position on this. So that's the book. But I want to go back, if you forgive me, and look a little bit way back. I'm not going to do this for very long, but this is a pretty appalling picture. It's in the Congo. It was taken by a lady called Alice Seeley Harris, who's a British missionary, English missionary. And she was exposing the terrible treatment of the Congolese by actually the Anglo-Belgian, as it said, India Rubber Company. And their militia were actually literally murdering and maiming people. And so this poor guy in the Sala is actually staring at the remains of his daughter, who had been a part of a cannibal fest. Now, I put that up because there is a history of photography almost from the beginning of trying to do social good and illustrate problems. And in fact, Alice Seeley Harris put this into a lantern show, which led to action against the Belgians, the Congolese, and eventually the withdrawal. It took a long time, but she was very, very much part of that whole process. That being said, photography was very much a English, French invention, and it was also a tool of empire. So there's a lot of the history of photography put together by white male photographers, and that's kind of an important part of this story. You can't get past it as soon as you start digging into the history of photography. And even sometimes the most well-intentioned things can lead to unintended consequences. So this is a picture of Alice with some of the children that she was in the missionary trying to save, but it's the ultimate white savior picture. So although Alice was trying to do the right thing, what was happening was that it was almost setting up her and the missionaries and in fact the English as the civilized group that could put the world straight, and therefore everybody had to follow what Britain was doing. And the other colonial powers were doing the same thing. And of course, it gets totally perverted. This is an image from the Liverpool Slavery Museum where black people were significantly abused. Happy Christmas, literally written on them for a Christmas card that was sent. Now, we have moved on from those days, but the reason I put it up is in many ways we haven't, because part of the academic debate about this is the role that colonialism plays in photography, how much there is true equality in photography, how much it's been a white preserve, a white privilege preserve, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And that's all bundled up in different people's views of this controversy. It's not as simple as just looking at a book. I'm going to show a few more slides, then I'll pause and we'll take some questions. So the book by Butturini, he was a designer, an Italian designer, quite a successful one by all accounts. And he took these photographs on a vacation trip. It was probably in '69, it could have been '68, but he put the book together in '69 and he self-published it. There was only 1,000 copies and it pretty much sold out straight away. So it's very, very hard to get a copy of the original Butturini book. But the context, when he was in London, what was going on? Well, I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a person of a certain age. And this was going on. Most of the photography in the newspapers at that time was actually sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was David Bailey, Terry O'Neill, these people that were doing glamorous photography. And music, however, was being influenced and changing. So the Beatles were part of this. Both the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were playing a lot of black music, Long Tall Sally being a perfect example of that. So there was definitely more awareness of different cultures, and that was starting to come about through the 60s. It didn't really happen much before that, but it still wasn't completely overt. This was also going on at the same time. The BBC's Black and White Minstrel Show was on from 1958 to 1978. And in fact, don't bother reading all the small print in this, but the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination tried to stop the show in the 60s. And it was declared by the BBC that it was not racially offensive because they asked the readers of the Daily Mail if they approved of the show. Some things never change, I guess. And then the show was kept going for another 10 years. So that was part of the mix at the time these pictures were being taken. History was changing. This was the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy the same year, which had reverberations across the world. But in the UK, we had Enoch Powell. Now, some of you may remember Enoch Powell, particularly unpleasant individual in so many ways. And he made a speech in 1968, which became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And it made reference to what was going on in the States, which was all about the civil rights movement. Said we didn't want that in the UK, and we really should be sending all the black people, all the immigrants that we'd invited over with Windrush and so on, send them back. To be honest, at that time, half the British population agreed with Enoch Powell. And if you do a book search on Amazon today, you'll find books published in the last 2 or 3 years justifying the Rivers of Blood speech, showing how it's all come true. My point in all of this is that there was a lot of good things going on, there was a lot of change, but there was still a massive amount of divide in British society when these images were taken. In fact, it was only in '68 that the government signed the UN Convention on Racial Discrimination or Non-Racial Discrimination. The laws had also just changed in the UK. It's like everything else, the laws might change, but society doesn't change straight away. At the same time, this is one of my pictures this time. I was a student at Leeds University, a newspaper photographer, and the apartheid was a big issue. And this was a demonstration in the university against apartheid to ransom the engineers president to get some money and work towards more of the campaign against the South African tour. Perhaps more importantly, this was a protest in the UK. There was a George Jackson, who was a US prisoner, by all accounts not a terribly nice individual, but he wrote a very good book and he became a cause célèbre. And that hit the streets of London, just like what's been happening recently with BLM has been hitting streets in the UK. They're not the same. I'm not saying that for a minute because they're different individuals. But I am saying there was a lot of turmoil in the system, very much the same as we're seeing at the moment. And of course, this was happening everywhere. And frankly, happened well after 1970s. In fact, frankly, you can see some of that still today.
That's a rehash of a Winston Churchill election slogan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, don't get me going on Winston Churchill. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. But yes, it is. And it was daubed on letterboxes and goodies as well. So I'm going to pause there. And if anybody's got any questions or comments, I'm happy to talk. Any thoughts, anybody?
I have a couple of thoughts, if I may.
Yeah.
I thought you did a really good job of putting together in a really brief, in quite a full way, a sort of a global kind of thumbnail picture of the kind of political shifts and balances going on. What I wanted to stress was how sometimes local or provincial or national ideas don't grow out of, they don't go global, or if they do, they don't do it immediately. So American racism has a long history of a guerrilla slur, let's call it that. Whereas I've been trying to find examples of that published in the 50s and 60s in Britain, and I've resolutely failed. So either it was less of a thing, and in Britain we had more of our own terminologies, like I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but gollywogs or wogs, and we just had different ways of doing racism. So
I'm glad you
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt. No, I thank you for your comment. I agree with that. I've been looking as well. Now the gollywog and the marmalade was still there until the 70s. That didn't go away. And the eeny, meeny, miny, mo was taught in school, and we all know where that went. So I think there were different ways, and you're absolutely right. I also looked for images with gorillas, and I couldn't actually find that. But there were lots of other ways of doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's really my point. So this was a local thing, and that Butturini was writing the book about London, and it was local, and it was an Italian taking of view. But there was so much global stuff going on, it was almost impossible for anybody to ignore that noise of what was going on in the world at the time. Anybody else got any thoughts before I move on?
All I would like to say is I was born in 41, so I grew up all in this area on through. It was in the West Country, in Western, actually, in the main. Yeah. And I must admit, I didn't come up against any of this until I didn't come up against anything like this, even when I started work. The only thing I can say is, the first day I was in work, I was asked by the manager to go down to the mill, ask for Darky, and to collect my eggs. Now, I never knew his name until 20 years later when I was in the meeting with him. Then I found out what his name was. Yeah. But I didn't class that, in my personal view, as being anything racial, because that's what I was told. But after that, his name, when I knew his name, I called him by his name. Yeah. But overall in my area, we didn't seem to have a lot of this going on, or I didn't see it, put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit younger than you, but not much, Tony. I can remember.
Excuse me. Was the person you're referring to actually coloured?
He wasn't coloured. He was born in this country, actually, in Bristol, and he was coloured. And the same as we also had a mute person in there, and he was always called Dummy. Mm-hmm. But it was the things that I started when I started work, when I was in the factory, these came out and you accepted it. Obviously, I didn't accept it after I found out what their names were.
Yeah.
That was only a personal view.
No, I mean, it's a common experience because society's changed and certain things happen. We did certain things and said certain things. I think that happened to all of us. I well remember at my grammar school, the very first black kids showing up in the 60s. And it was impossible for them to get into the grammar school before about 1966, I think. And I remember them coming to school, the first two black kids at grammar school, which actually did change the way I started to think about things, I must admit. Any other thoughts before we move on? So what I'm trying to do here is set the stage. I'm not particularly pointing fingers at anybody. And I'm also not trying to say that Britain was a particularly bad or particularly good place. I'm just trying to say it is what it is. And it was actually quite polarized. And it's therefore not surprising that we end up with controversy even now, because the polarization, frankly, has never gone away. Let me move on to the book. So the book, you've probably seen a couple of, I don't know, has anybody seen pictures of the rest of the book or just the famous? Yeah, I know you would have done, Dennis, but probably just you and me. So the rest of the book, it's a really interesting book. If you take away the controversy, the book was made in an environment where photography was largely about celebrity, actually. The Rolling Stones and film stars and Beatles and all this kind of stuff was going on. It was starting, the Sunday Times magazine was starting up. It was starting to get journalism. People like McCullum was starting to kick in. They were all stories, mainly stories outside of the UK, although obviously not all. Some were about poverty inside the UK as well. But that was the sort of the photographic background. So along came Butturini, and he does these very gritty, grainy, high contrast, slightly blurry images, very reminiscent, for anybody that knows it, of the Japanese Provoke and Daido Moriyama is particularly a favorite of mine. And I think that's probably what caught Martin Parr's attention, because the images are very gritty and very urban, and they've got a certain vitality to them. And he was, Butturini was a designer. So it's pretty fair to say that you can see how the book was designed. So let me show you some of the spreads. People in the streets. We might take pictures like that today, except now, of course, they're of a certain time and age and date. The fashions date them. He was very interested in people in London, what they were doing, staring into space, reading newspapers. Had he mentioned mobile phone, you could have written that statement today, because that's what people do in the street, and that's what he was taking pictures of. So he was a street photographer. But he did create these nice spreads. He put them together. You could see juxtaposition of images that worked and actually took your attention for a little while. Sometimes in opposition, like this. I think that's quite a nice spread. The girl's reading over on one side, there's complete nonchalance with a cigarette in the middle. And then I'm not sure what this guy's doing, but somehow he's just outside of their frame.
I noticed there was a black woman on the last frame.
There was, yeah, in that one. But I think that was more, I'll come back to that in a minute. I think that was more coincidence in the way he took these pictures. And then there were spreads, babies and motherhood. He was interested in all the things you might expect in the 60s, basically pop art, soap, lipsticks, hairsprays, breasts, groins, all kinds of stuff. He was like everybody else then, fascinated with the street and pop and what was going on. And you could see that. I mean, this couple on the tube, it could have been me actually with the tie, but I think I had longer hair than that. And then you've got the opposition. You've got this one, which is quite interesting, where you've got probably somebody that's homeless with somebody that's a collector of something in another part of London. Oppositions of wealth and poverty, perhaps. He was trying to make a point. Another one that's quite obvious, this one where he captured a march, socialism, and as a worker cleaning his boots. This one's perhaps the most obvious in that regard. You've got a guy with the Israeli flag, and then you got barbed wire. Now, Butturini doesn't actually make comments about any of these spreads in the book. and that I don't know if Dennis has found anything, but I have found no literature where he's talked about the book outside of what was written in the book itself. So we're all doing this based on the book. And there's nothing about these spreads in the book other than these general statements, except for one thing, which I'll come back to in a minute. He did mention black people specifically in the introduction, although I think that's probably quite perceptive and quite sympathetic in many ways. I don't know why he was chased out of Portobello Road. One could surmise it simply was a street photographer that managed to piss people off. I think we've all done that in the past. Maybe there was something else going on. I do not know. We have no history of that. But there's nothing in those statements, to me at least, which reads it that Butturini was trying to make some particular point about blacks and racism. Do you have a different point on that, Dennis?
No, just a question. Do we know Butturini's English language skills, or could this have been a translation? Because it reads a little like a translation, but that might just be a second language thing.
I think he was quite well educated. It's a really good point, and I'm going to make a mental note to myself to go find out about that. But I think he could speak English, but I don't know if it was translated. If somebody went over it, in other words, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And then he did do some spreads, which were specifically including black people. Street photos, frankly. No particular thing going on. It's the kind of picture you might take today. Interesting conjunction of circumstance. I don't read anything into that particularly. No, that's an interesting spread of people's lives. And the same with this. I actually quite like this spread because it's capturing something of the character of the people involved. And that is basically the majority of the book. There's a lot of other spreads, but they're all in that same kind of vein. Except he specifically mentions two pictures in the text, and they're the only two pictures that he mentions is an entire introduction in the book. And I'll let you read them for a minute. Can you read them okay? Everybody had a chance to read that? Yeah. So how do I interpret that? Well, taking the two paragraphs separately, first of all, because they were not together in the introduction. They were in slightly different parts of the introduction, so they weren't combined in the introductory words, although they were fairly close together in the introduction. The idea of somebody, whether black or anything, any other race for that matter, being trapped in a cage doing work they don't particularly like, strikes me as a pretty good observation. The fact that it happened to be a black woman, yes, and that makes sense because there was a lot of British transport workers were specifically hired by British Transport from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s to come and do that work because they couldn't get people to do the job in England otherwise. The idea of a gorilla in a zoo, now Dennis would know more about this than me, but the gorillas always struck me as a very imperial, dignified animal. I think that strikes me as an appropriate tonality, but they are trapped in a zoo. They're trying to hold on to their dignity, but they're trapped. So I'm not trying to be an apologist here, but I am saying those two statements taken at face value, I don't think there's anything in it other than an observation. However,
the paragraphs you left out talk about how he didn't want to photograph the bowler-hatted bankers,
yes,
and the changing of the guards, both of whom would have been kind of white postcard London.
Yeah, well, I didn't interpret them as white, but I interpreted them as tourist stereotypes. But you're right. He deliberately didn't do that. He was absolutely into the gritty side of the street, much more than he was in taking pictures of Buckingham Palace. That's a good observation, Dennis. Thank you. So that, of course, led to this spread. Now, to be honest, even in 1969, that would have been unacceptable to people like me, at least, because it was a pretty terrible opposition of images. And it's not surprising. It's actually not at all. pleasing people today. It's a really bad opposition of images. And I am quite surprised, because Butturini seemed to have done everything else quite deliberately. So one senses that he must have done this deliberately too, but we don't know why, and we don't understand any of the motivations why he did it. So again, I'm not trying to let him off the hook. I might say it was a massive mistake. It was a massive own goal. It was a really bad joke that went wrong, or it was a product of the times. I don't know. But there was no literature, as Dennis said, about gorillas that I could find, and black people. So it seemed to be a deliberate opposition of images. And that is what led to the current debate. So again, I'm in no way thinking that's a good spread. I really don't like it at all. And I don't think he should have done it. But I am saying that that's the background to how it got to this point. So let me pause there and see if anybody's got any more comments or observations.
Sorry, Mick, I don't know if you can hear me okay.
Yeah, can.
I suppose it wasn't really until coming along to your talk this evening that I kind of, can you put the image back for a second? That I, based on what you've told me about him, because I didn't know a huge amount about him and his style, I knew at surface level, but perhaps if you're saying that what he did was kind of try to observe the darker side of the street, perhaps the grittier side, that his observation here might well have been one of trying perhaps to put across the point that there was oppression, oppression of people being forced into crap jobs, and being treated poorly and paid badly, and then the similarity with the idea of an animal in a zoo. But I think the bit that has upset, so yeah, the observation as oppression, perhaps, but I don't know. I think that the issue here now is that people just simply see or translate this as he saw two, I don't know how to put this. He was looking purely at aesthetics for similarities between the gorilla and the person in terms of how they look. And that's where it ends, and it's just pure racism. But I mean, again, I'm not trying to defend him, because I've found all of this really difficult to kind of wrap my head around in the past however many months. But yeah, I wonder then if this was just simply him trying to raise awareness of oppression and what was happening, and to not pass judgment. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's impossible to know what was in his mind unless somebody can find that in the archives. I haven't found it, but I think it's quite likely that what he was trying to do was raise the issue in a way that he thought would get people's attention, just like he did with some of the other spreads. I think that's absolutely true. And I also think, I would agree with you, Jem, the book itself is a very aesthetically driven book. He was a designer, so it's not just the images, it's also the aesthetics that was very much driving him as a designer. So I think a charitable view of this was that it was a misinformed mistake. I think it would be going too far to say that Butturini was saying that black people were like apes, that therefore he was a racist. I don't see any evidence for that.
Neither do I. Mick.
Yeah.
Hi. I'd never heard of Butturini before this issue came up, and I think it's a bit unfortunate it's happened in this particular set of circumstances. But the one thing I did want to raise is that, having read interviews on some literature by BLM activists, the fact is that whether or not any of us, white, European, whatever we are, people, find this particular juxtaposition of image offensive is irrelevant, because we don't get to decide what is racism in the terms of the current politics of BLM.
Well, I think that's a good statement, John, an interesting one. If you show this to as I have done, I'm sure Dennis has done, if you talk with black people about this image, they really do not like this image. So we don't get to choose. And Dennis is right. There's a whole history of this kind of imagery in America. And in fact, hold your horses, because you wait till the very last slide I have today, which will probably blow your mind. But I think that, well, sorry, Dennis, looks like you're going to say something.
Sure. Let me very as quickly as I can add just a bit of granular detail to both of those images. Just for the record, I'm Chinese, and the Chinese have had a similar sort of guerrilla slur, mostly in America, from about 1900s onwards. So yeah, I'm not detached from this in any way. So the first, I'll take it from the woman. What I wanted to add, and you touched on this already, this is not just a black woman, this is a Transport for London worker. Now, at the time, the worst job in the underground was a fluffer. And you literally went after hours cleaning the tunnels with a rag. That's what you did. She is way above that. She is customer facing. She's, Butturini says that she's selling tickets. She's not selling tickets. She's a ticket inspector.
Oh, is that right? How do you know that, Dennis? I didn't know.
Because there is no apparatus for her to sell the tickets, and she's sitting in one of the wooden kiosks that a ticket inspector would have sat in.
Actually, no. Well, now I look at it, in her right hand, does she have one of those clip machines that would actually clip a ticket to say?
Yeah, she may do. Yeah.
No, I think she does, actually.
So
I used to have the old-fashioned clipper where you would clip a ticket, put a hole in it, so it's been used.
Right.
So from the top, we can see her underground roundel on her hat, and we know that she's got a customer-facing job as a ticket inspector. So she is ranking so far above the bottom of them. And then you were absolutely right. TfL had a massive West Indies recruitment drive from the 1950s onwards. By 1968, there were approximately 9,000 black people employed by TfL out of an entire staff of about, I think it was about sort of 72,000, but I can come back on those stats. And so they were probably the largest single employer of black immigrants in Britain. Now, most of those were men, so she's doing so well because the women sort of get shunted to the canteens. That's where you'll find most of them, and she's got a customer-facing job. So this isn't the worst job. This is one of the good jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's so if we look at what she's wearing her own coat, which wouldn't have been regulation. So all of the jackets and all of the outdoor coats from TfL from the 60s and 70s are black or a dark color. And hers isn't. So that's her own coat. And so we know that she's just about to go home. This is the end of her shift. She's exhausted. She's doing really well. She's got a good job, not a bad job. And she's larger than life. She's wedged in this little box, which quite frankly was made for spindly kind of white Englishmen kind of 30 years before her, right? So I wanted to kind of add all that, and I wanted to add one last thing. We don't have ticket inspectors anymore. Why? Because we have automated turnstiles. The first automated turnstile came into the underground in 1968 on the first leg of the Victoria line. Right. So she has a great job that's just about to be made obsolete. She's working with a pretty relatively forward-thinking employer who hires a lot of black people. So in 1964, a Sikh wanted to not wear a cap. They all have a cap. They have different caps of men and women at different ranks. And he wanted to wear his roundel on his turban. And after a little protest, they went, yeah, that's absolutely appropriate. And if you Google that, you'll see him proudly wearing his underground roundel on his turban. So she's in all that. She's at the end of this 20-year recruitment. But what happens in 1968, her job gets threatened by automation. And also there's this pressure, there's this downward pressure to stop this kind of influx of immigrants. So we have the third, I think, Commonwealth Act. That's 1968, sort of curbing the number of immigrants that come in. And, and she's already been ousted out by technology. So she's riding the end of a 20-year wave that seemed to look pretty optimistic. She was doing so well. And now it looks like the country's just turned their back on her. And she's exhausted. She's at the end of her shift. And we're just going to throw her out because we don't want her anymore. Like you said, rivers of blood, it's going to happen, right?
Yes, thank you for that, Dennis. I did not have that in my head, so I have it now. Thank you. That's really good.
I just want to say something if I can, Mick.
Yeah, absolutely.
The problem I have is the entire rest of the book, you can tell that huge amounts of thought and attention have been put into pairing up images into spreads that complement each other.
Correct. That's
So
correct.
I cannot believe that this would be just pure accident on that. You wouldn't even unconsciously in your mind know that putting a picture of a black lady next to a primate or a monkey, to say, is not going to have racist connotations. I just cannot believe that no one would pick up on that.
I may be able to shed some light on that if I can just intrude on your time a bit more.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, you said it was a monkey. It's not a monkey, it's a gorilla. And not only is it a gorilla, it's the gorilla. Everybody in England in 1968 knows who this gorilla is. This is Guy the gorilla from London.
Yeah.
He was there from 1947, and he became the post-war pet of Britain. Everybody loved him. 3.5 million visitors a year went to see him.
But the book doesn't say that. You don't know that from looking at the picture. It could be any gorilla.
We do, because what there is there is an entire legacy of photographing zoo animals, which Butturini would have known about. So Wolfgang Zukitsky, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a Jewish emigre, and he single-handedly transformed zoo photography. He did it. The pinnacle of his photographic career was a portrait of the same gorilla in the late 40s, before he went on to become the cinematographer for Born Free, the sort of wildlife documentary film that we know and love. So the reason why Zukitsky and other emigre photographers turned to animal photography was that they didn't have work permits to legally work in the UK, but they were allowed to sell photos, and these sold. And so very quickly, a whole generation of them sort of made this niche market their own. And so I think there is an element that he's sort of tapping into an outsider's political exile take on animals here. I think that's very, very deliberate.
Yeah, no, I did know the thing about Guy the gorilla. I was trying to keep it short, but yes, that's right. That is actually the most famous gorilla in the UK at the time. There's no question about that.
Throw in
It's still just,
Well, hang on. Let me go back to your point, Daz. So I
racism.
actually agree with you that every spread in this book was done very deliberately.
Yeah,
I agree with that point, because and that's what I was trying to demonstrate as I showed the spreads. It's a very well thought through book. So there is no question in my mind that he deliberately put these two together. It wasn't an accident.
yes.
He was obviously trying to make a point. The problem that we have is we don't actually know what point it was he was trying to make, because we're all guessing.
That's kind of irrelevant, though, isn't it?
Well, no, it is and it isn't.
Well,
part of it.
The interpretation of the artwork that's come out of it is, everyone will undoubtedly say that this is just, it just looks racist.
Yes, it does. As an image, as a spread, it does. Yeah. Absolutely.
It does look quite bad.
It does. But doesn't make,
if this was in America in 1969, it would be racist, but it's not in America.
Yeah, it is racist. There's no question about it. And I'm not defending Butturini at all. It's a racist image, and he shouldn't have done it. I said that a few minutes ago.
I think, excuse me, it's my thinking now, after listening to some of this discussion, that Butturini's intention, looking at his other work in the book, a lot of which is very impressive, and I just wish I'd seen some of this work sooner. His actual intention was to disturb his audience in a very sort of on Mercy's late 60s sort of way. The fact is that this attempt has misfired, or it's genuinely disturbed us, albeit with a 50-year gap.
No, I think it absolutely is something that misfired. I think there's no doubt in my mind, at least, and I suspect Dennis
hello,
that Butturini probably had quite good intentions in this work.
Hello.
Sorry, James. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I've been trying to say something, and nobody was responding, and my box isn't lighting up. So
go for it. Your box is now lighting up, James.
Okay, it's not lighting up for me.
Well, go for it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to throw in a few hand grenades, as I normally do. I've been listening very carefully to what you have to say, and I think we have to be concerned about the context of this. And the context of this was, 50 years ago, And in 1969, I remember going to see the black and white minstrels in London. And it was my school that took me there on a school trip to London. They deemed that an outing that was suitable for all the class was to go and see the black and white minstrels. And so I think there's a whole thing about the context of the narrative changing over time. I also think this is, to me, it's a brilliant metaphor spread, of the, the imprisonment of an animal with nobility and a person who's working in a job. And I hate to say this, Dennis, but I think the narrative that I heard from you was one that sort of justifies your position on this, going into detail about what a great job she's got and things like that. Well, it doesn't look to me as if she's...
No, it's a job that's about to become obsolete, but it has been a great job.
Yeah, but even so, she doesn't look as if she's enjoying her job.
No, she's been spat out. And the same will apply to the gorilla. The gorilla...
Dennis, hang on.
Dennis, do you mind shutting up?
Let James finish.
Of course.
Yeah. You see, Dennis, you're very vocal. I thought I was a vocal person. Very vocal about putting your perspective without anybody challenging it. I'm terribly sorry to have to say that to you. I don't know you, but I dislike that intensely.
I'm sorry.
Good. I'm glad you're sorry. Thank you for apologising. But I think that this isn't about she having a great job. This isn't to me an observation about the history of employment of these people and what a great job she has because she's got a white coat and she doesn't have to have a uniform and things like that. It's one of resignation. It's an image of, it's an observation of, profound boredom and just being there to earn the money. And I think it's a perfect juxtaposition with the animal in a cage. It's unfortunate that it's a gorilla, but.
Well, can I make a comment on that? Because I just, last bit, James, I don't agree with. I'm sorry. So I understand. I actually thank Dennis for the analysis of the image because I've been looking at this image a lot and there's some stuff there I hadn't seen. So I am actually appreciative of that. But that doesn't take away from me the fact that as a spread, this is fundamentally an offensive spread. And it was an offensive spread in 1969, as it was. And it's an offensive spread in 2020, as it is. And it's very hard to get away from that. So I can make all, I've had little bits of this conversation before with other people, and I've had lots of people say, well, maybe it's getting people to think. Well, yeah, right. So if you're a black person looking at this spread, what would you think? You wouldn't like it very much. So he's trying to get white people to think. Well, maybe you should think of better ways of getting white people to think about what they're doing to black people, not comparing black people to gorillas, which is what this actually does. So I don't have too much time for this spread at all, even though I quite like the book. But I think that the very fact that we're having this debate is a very good thing because this sort of stuff gets hidden all the time.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I know I'm not trying to cut short the debate.
Could I just ask quickly something?
Yes.
The Martin Parr version is a reprint, correct?
It is, yes.
Yes, and this is 2017, the reprint?
Correct.
Okay, so my comment is, and I agree with lots of, Dennis, you sound very educated and I love your points of view of the individual images, but why is this coming to the forefront today in respect of Black Lives Matter?
Right, which is
this has been out here 4 years. This has been out here, and nobody has discussed this in this powerful way globally, and this book now has resurfaced 4 years plus.
Right. So can I answer that with my next slide?
Yeah, sure. Apologies.
No, not at all, because the next sequence of this is about the current brouhaha, the current debate. Okay. And I just want to give you a little bit of a timeline on that debate. So Martin Parr actually put on an exhibition in 2016, which included some of Butturini's images. It didn't include the guerrilla image, and it didn't include the black underground workers image. It included others, and it was a show which included people like Walker Evans and Gary Winogrand, all kinds of people. It was put on at the Barbican. That was actually 4 years ago, and he liked the images. He thought they were saying something about London, and that was what he put on. So then he decided to get involved in this book, putting out a new edition. I said before, 1,000 copies were made originally. They all sold out. They weren't really in existence anymore. And he got involved in creating a new book. Well, there was a young lady, as you can see here, Mercedes Baptiste Halliday, and she was given a book, this book, by her father as a present, right? And she's studying, I'm not sure if it's design or photography, but she's definitely studying one or the other. And she took exception to this spread. At the same time as she was given this book, there was an exhibition in London, Only Human by Martin Parr, which is in that picture, which I went to, and I think a few other people went to. It was actually quite a good show. And she decided to try to bring people's attention to this issue at that point. It had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. It had everything to do with an individual that thought this was the wrong kind of thing to be putting out there. Her debate, to be clear, as I understand it, was not to somehow cancel Martin Parr and all the other stuff. There was not a single word of explanation in any of the reprint about this spread. And there was no comment at all from Martin Parr about this spread. And in fact, when the issue, slightly out of sequence. When the issue hit social media, Martin Parr's assistants basically did a shrug and tried to poo-poo the whole issue. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing that was clear at the same time, some of you might remember this spread. Martin Parr shot a commercial spread for Vogue magazine. This was part of that spread. Now, if you go to Instagram, you'll see a lot of people think, oh, what a wonderful photograph. You know, lots of body shapes and all the rest of it. Absolutely. But you'll also see a current of people that said, wait a minute, it's pretty obvious who the hero of that picture is. And it's not actually one of the black Brazilian. Maybe it's a white Brazilian, but this does seem to be a questionable image. So there's a certain amount of tone deafness, if nothing else, not only in Martin Parr, but in Vogue, for putting this together in such a way. It's a really interesting image. And I'm not going to spend time analyzing this image. You can analyze it 56 ways through Christmas, trust me. But it's a really interesting point of context at that moment in time.
Sorry.
To say something.
Yeah, John here. Couldn't it be the case that that's the image that Vogue magazine chose from maybe a shoot of 50?
Yeah, but he put the spread together. He's Martin Parr. He has some influence over what gets put out.
He did, but surely Vogue had the final say.
There was a spread of about 15 images, and it's pretty obvious what the intent of that image was. So anyway, we're not here to debate that image. Maybe we can do that in another Zoom. But my point, Mark rightly asked the question, why did this come up, right? Partly it came up because of a fairly tone-deaf Martin Parr. That's partly what happened, and partly because of the timing of the book, Mercedes, and the exhibition. That was all before Black Lives Matter. So this is what was on Twitter and Facebook at the time. Mercedes is behind Less Than Human Debate. Roland's one of the people that picked it up. I happen to know him. That was in Facebook. And in fact, that was last May. So this whole issue came up in May. It was raised with the Martin Parr Foundation. It was raised with Martin Parr. Nothing happened. All they got was shrugs and whatevers and whatever, right? And the book was still being merchandised. Then this happened. Yeah, we all know this. This happened just a few weeks ago, right? All of a sudden, consciousness starts to grow of the issue. Yeah. So it comes back on social media, which it did, which led to Martin Parr resigning. He resigned because of the book. And what's interesting, and I will take questions in a minute, what's interesting is actually what he said. And I'd like you to read his letter to Mercedes. You have this, yes, Martin? Sorry, Dennis, you have this.
Yes.
How are we doing on reading it?
Done.
All right. So a couple of observations on that. I just love the 60-year-old white guy excuse. I'm going to use that myself every time in future. I think that is the most stupid thing anybody could possibly say. I'm also totally bemused that he doesn't really explain why it was overlooked. He argued earlier that he tried to argue he wasn't the editor of this book, and yet he was out there signing books, and it was on YouTube. It's all over YouTube. Actually, most of those videos are now gone, by the way, selling the book. So he did it. So when I first wrote on this, my take on it, before I got into a really detailed discussion of Butturini, was that Martin Parr wasn't actually looking. So how an editor in the 21st century can claim to be the editor of a new book without actually looking at a book and deciding whether it's good or bad. And even if he decided the spread was bad, making comment about it, or maybe even changing the order of pages, frankly, that is completely beyond me. It's one thing to publish, like I published tonight, historical artifacts of people making fun of black people at Christmas time, but I put it in context. Martin Parr put no context whatsoever on his book. So this went from a situation where he was being asked to apologize and provide context to a resignation with almost no middle ground going on. And before I take any more questions, let me just show you a couple more pieces of document. So this is his apology. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, this is Mercedes' response to Martin. So it's pretty clear that she'd been upset and didn't want to show up at the Martin Parr Foundation. And to my knowledge, he still doesn't have any plan to do so. And then the apology that's on public view. This is on Parr's website. Actually, it doesn't mention the issue at all. It doesn't mention racism, and it doesn't actually expand on the issue whatsoever. Fortunately, it doesn't use the 70-year-old white guy excuse, but. And then as Daz pointed out to me, let's make up with the bursary for Black, Asian and minority ethnic photographers, which is what the foundation is now doing. So my point on all of this is that it was never dealt with when it first came up as an issue, which was actually well before Black Lives Matters. It was not dealt with. In fact, it was shrugged off and it was ignored. And in fact, why was it shrugged off? Because it was a black teenager that was making the noise. Now, Dennis and I have both had grief from people like Paul Halliday recently, very vocal on Twitter, right? Because there's been a lot of help thrown into this. But at the time when this came up, nobody was taking any notice. And I have to admit, maybe Mercedes wasn't there when I saw the Parr event, but I didn't know this protest was going on at the time. I only caught up with it later when it hit social media. So it was a completely tone-deaf response. It was too little, too late. And then it became a massive issue. So now we look at the other side of it. Now, I don't know if any of you are subscribers to Spiked. I kind of hope not, but you never know. It's a very right-wing online journal, and they considered this to be the cancellation of Martin Parr. Okay, well, in my humble opinion, this isn't the cancellation of Martin Parr. This is actually asking Martin Parr to apologize and explain why he did what he did with these particular images. He's still Martin Parr. He's still got all of his legacy. Nobody's talking about cancellation. This is just hyperbole, truthfully. Even Mercedes isn't talking about cancellation. Nobody's talking about that. Martin Parr is still Martin Parr. He was tone deaf for 18 months before this was dealt with. And then it hit a crisis. And by the way, this is my last slide. And I hope you're going to take a deep breath. That was 2 weeks ago. And I took out the surname to protect the innocent. But if we seriously think this issue has gone away, we have another think coming, because it's still out there. It's still what people say, and it's still what people think. And that's my last slide. So if anybody's got any thoughts on that last section, happy to hear them. Dennis.
I'd like to complicate that narrative involving the young Baptiste Halliday. So I went exhaustively through Twitter, and it took me 3 days to read everything from 2019 onwards. And the thing that comes up is that Paul Halliday seems to start the ball rolling. He's the anonymous photographer mentioned in the leaflet they hand out. One of his tweets confirms that he was helping to hand things out at this protest. And then only later does he kind of talk about it in terms of his daughter. Now, Paul Halliday is an important name because he's not any photographer. Just as Baptiste Halliday isn't just any black teenage girl. Paul Halliday is the director of Photo Fusion from 2007 to 15. And then he goes on to become the module convener at Goldsmiths for the Masters in Photography and Urban Culture. So this isn't a grassroots protest. This is an academy-led protest.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
That's been fronted by who was then an 18-year-old girl.
No, I agree with that, Dennis. That's absolutely correct. And in fact, it's really hard to prove a connection between Paul and Mercedes. It's actually quite difficult to do that.
It says it in the Spiked piece.
Yeah, it does actually. You're right. But other than that, it's not really and not many people read Spike. Maybe just you and me. But,
Mick, sorry. I think that's very interesting background, Dennis. I was not aware of this. And having looked at Mercedes Baptiste Halliday's Facebook page, there's no indication anywhere that I can see in her recent posts that her father is Paul Halliday, lecturer at Goldsmiths.
Correct.
Having said that, a protest is a protest is a protest. And the current mood that's provoked the entire BLM thing is a frankly toxic one. And it's a situation that has existed for decades. We all know this. And things just seem to keep getting worse. Things are not improving. Things are getting worse. And we now live in we don't have to accept that we live in a more sensitized environment when it comes to issues of race, whatever our personal backgrounds, whether our parents are photographers or whatever, yeah. And I have to take this on board. I could count on one hand the number of black people I've actually known well enough to have a conversation with. That's irrelevant. When I encounter the very rare occasions when I think I've encountered actual racism around me, I end up keeping very quiet for various reasons. I think a lot of people now, people say silence equals violence, but I think a lot of people in our position are keeping quiet because we don't want to inadvertently put our foot into it. So I think for Paul Halliday to whether he's used his daughter as a pawn in some sense or not, I think for him to step forward and for Martin Parr to acknowledge there's a problem is of credit to all involved, actually. I just think it's a bit of a pity that Mr. Butturini and his otherwise very appreciable photography has had to be brought to the forefront in these circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's well said, John. Generally speaking, I don't think people are trying to go after Butturini too much in this. Martin Parr seems to be more of the so-called target. And actually, some of you know my background was in marketing and general management and business, right? From a crisis management point of view, the Martin Parr organization handled this appallingly badly.
Yeah, that's exactly my point, Mick.
Had they, sorry, let me just finish the point.
Yeah.
So had they got ahead of this, had they responded when it first came up, and more importantly, as a photographer, as an editor, if you put your name to a book, I don't know about you guys, but when I do a book, I read everything and I make sure it's okay before it goes out there. So how somebody can claim to be an editor without going through this and actually seeing this spread, which is completely unmissable, and then ignoring it, frankly, is completely beyond me. Yeah. So I think it was a complete mess that was largely self-inflicted by Martin Parr, even with the issues around the spread in the first place and the intentions of Butturini and so on. And now, of course, it's got to the point where it's become culture wars. So that's my take on all of this. Yeah. Sorry, anybody else got thoughts on this?
I thought Martin's response was very corporate, very law written. 18 months ago, oh, we don't know how to really respond to this, or we don't want to respond to it. We'll put it underneath the bed type of thing, and hopefully it goes away. And that's what I can see written between the words. And nothing was addressed in the responses, basically, as far as I can see. Why was the images left in there originally? Was Martin a name? Wasn't really the editor? You could discuss that. Were they left in there as a provoking image for people to buy it? Oh my God, have you looked at this picture, the spread? You know, there's so many questions that are there that aren't answered.
Mick, have you got both books?
No, sadly I haven't, but I can assure you that the sequence of images in both books is the same.
So why did he claim to be an editor if it wasn't edited?
Because he did a new edition. He wrote a foreword to the book.
Okay.
And there is actually it's a different, slightly different size, and there's a whole foreword, yeah, in this thing. Martin Parr.
Like,
Yeah.
surely you would only ever write a foreword if you were kind of critically informed about what you're writing the foreword about. I mean, why would you write a foreword without understanding the work?
Well, that's what I wrote about, as you know, last summer when I did this. It's like, how the hell can you claim to be an editor if you don't actually know the work? And even if you think something is controversial, then you should at least say it's going to be controversial. Yeah. None of that was covered.
He could have contextualized the work, and he could have said that this raises all kinds of questions and I have concerns over these spreads or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. He could have done something, but I would argue that Martin Parr's work on the whole has been kind of, I don't want to say what I'm really thinking. What I'm really thinking is it's centered around making fun and othering people. But that's his whole career, really, in my opinion. That's how I see quite a lot of that comes from Martin. But, you know, other people could say again that Martin's work is just observation. I don't know.
I think I would agree that his work is observation, albeit of a type that what I think I wanted to say was that I mentioned this on Facebook when this discussion first arose, but I visited the Martin Parr Gallery a bit more than a year ago. And it occurs to me that Parr has never shied away from promoting images that someone somewhere, maybe mildly or perhaps even more definitively offended by.
Yeah.
When I went to the gallery, I think last June, there were 3 sets of exhibition photographs. One was landscape photography from Scotland, actual pictures of the Highlands and Islands in various places. One was a set of pictures taken in Glasgow, at least one of which showed a Rangers football scarf which contained the numbers 1690, which, if you know the west of Scotland, that can be every bit as offensive and provoking to a certain part of the population as anything that BLM have had to deal with recently. And the third set of photographs were taken in a Masonic lodge in Jamaica with Jamaican Masons wearing their regalia and everything else. Now, you maybe need to be just a little bit less than thin-skinned to genuinely appreciate what's going on there. If you're very easily offended, I can appreciate a situation where maybe half a dozen people would have walked out of that exhibition. Had it been shown in Scotland, more than half a dozen might have walked out. So it's my belief that Parr is quite aware that the photographs in this book could, not definitely would, but potentially could provoke a type of reaction. Perhaps it's spun out of control a bit, but the fact is that the way it's been handled, and yes, it sounds a bit corporatized, it sounds a little bit of element of legalese, and maybe a little bit disingenuous. I think the whole thing's been handled, as I said before, to everyone's credit, and we're now very aware of the work of Mr. Butturini.
Yeah, no, I
and
think
everything else that is attached to BLM.
I mean, there's no question that Martin Parr's career, as Jem said, has been made on othering people. That's absolutely true. You've only got to look. Yeah, I mean, honestly, John, all you got to do is look at it. You can, if you study the work and you study other photographers, it's interesting as well. Look up the work of Dougie Wallace, who's a protege of Martin Parr.
Is that a Newcastle photographer?
No, he's actually from Glasgow.
Okay.
And he's an interesting character. I know him actually, but you know, some of the it's always the issue with street photography. To what extent are you othering people? To what extent are you observing? It's a really interesting balance, right? But I think in the case of this particular book and this particular spread, it went past the point, in my opinion.
The Barbican exhibition you mentioned was specifically about international photographers photographing London, so they're sort of outsiders doing London.
Yeah, it was, and as I said, it included people like Winogrand and all kinds of people. So it's some really illustrious names in it. And there was nothing particularly controversial, as far as I know, from Butturini in that show, other than some of these images, the other spreads.
May I give you a fun fact about guerrilla photography?
Go for it.
So when this racial trope of guerrillas starts, it's kind of fueled by Darwin, who compares people to gorillas, and sort of they snowball it out in America. But the opposite is also true. So as soon as that happens, there's another group of people who go, hang on, gorillas are like our cousins in evolutionary terms, so we ought to take better care of them. And by 1901, there are the Natural History Museum's calling for a national park to protect the Congo. And it's doing it on the basis that there are gorillas there. And when photographers start photographing gorillas, and they've got this sort of ecological emphasis in mind, they're looking for a certain kind of visual iconography to use. And this is really early research for me, but they end up using abolitionist and civil rights movement sort of visual tropes. So if anything looks like something that would support the rights of Black people and there's a gorilla in it, it's because they're trying to do the same for gorillas. There's a really amazing sequence from Life magazine in the 1950s. And Life magazine decides to take this completely to extremes, and not content with a sensitive portrait of a zoo gorilla. They go out to Africa to photograph gorilla huntings. And quite frankly, all of their images look like lynchings. It's absolutely astonishing what they do. So there is this, we tend to read from the human being down to the gorilla. But what I just wanted to say was that the reverse is also true. And so, and it applies to Guy the gorilla specifically. I said earlier that he was the most loved animal in England, but he divides opinion. People love him, but they also recognize that he's been thoroughly abused. I have a book here, published in the early 70s, Lucy Boston's Stranger at Green No. I'll send a link to it. And it's all about a captive gorilla. And she writes this, and I quote her. She says she was inspired by the misuse of life that she saw at London Zoo. And so there's this really problematic thing, photographing the country's most loved animal.
Yeah, no, I should also add to that, actually, just to be the philosopher, as I sometimes can be, as some of you know, that Linnaeus, who some of you probably are quite fond of, Jem, right?
No,
I'm not fond of him.
Well, okay. But actually had an awful lot to do with how we think about the species, was very clear that about the fact that the whites were superior to the blacks. And in fact, David Hume, who happens to be my favorite philosopher, right? Although he didn't make a big deal out of it, also has a footnote in one of his works saying exactly the same thing. And if you go to the work of Immanuel Kant, whose categorical imperative pretty much is how we live our lives these days, funnily enough, he was extremely clear about the way the races should be considered, including the American Indians and so on and so forth. So sadly, there is a whole literature which underpins a lot of the way we've all been taught, which, you know, frankly, underpins a lot of this nonsense and crap. And we can't really avoid it. So anyway, sorry, I'm waxing lyrical. Any other thoughts on this particular issue before anything else? Daz, is this what you wanted?
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have the debate. I mean, it is a controversial issue and an issue of our time. So, we all have to be wary of this when we approach our photography, because I'm a street photographer myself, and I have to be wary of how I context the people I'm taking the images of.
Yeah, well, as you know, when I've done the street photography talks, I do talk quite a lot about gaze and othering of people. It's, I've got a lot of experience of shooting overseas, obviously, and sometimes we think about it in different ways when doing it on the streets of Bath. But we do, sadly, tend to other people, even when we're taking pictures on the streets of Bath. And it don't need to be black, they can be anything, as I've shown in a few of my presentations recently, which to me is also one of the lessons of this. To me, my main takeaway, I'll do a summary, and then maybe everybody's tired and we should move on. But I really do appreciate everybody getting involved in this. I think it's been great, and I've definitely learned some stuff myself, which I'm going to go follow up on. Thank you for that. My takeaway on this is that I think Butturini was trying to do a good observational job. I don't think he was trying to be a racist. In fact, I think he was trying to be the opposite. I think he made a massive mistake with this spread. I think that if you bring it to the current time, I think the Parr Foundation and Parr himself have made massive errors in this, right from when they started looking at editing the book all the way through to how they handled it. And to be honest, unless something miraculous happens, I, for one, am always going to now consider Martin Parr a 70-year-old white guy that's totally tone deaf, because that's exactly what he's come out of this for me. I really dislike this spread, but I'm glad that the image has been raised. I know I can't get to grips with the relationships and the Mercedes and the Pauls. I understand what Dennis is saying on that. I know there's a lot of murkiness in all of that, and there seems to be a lot of hidden agendas. And I certainly agree with the point that Paul runs one of the most prestigious MAs in the UK, and therefore has a lot to say. I think a lot of what's been said on Twitter has been far too extreme on this case. But partly that's been self-inflicted by Parr. So my take on it is that it's a really bad spread. It's been handled really badly. I'm glad it's been brought up. But if you remember the last image that I showed you of some of the comments on Spike just 2 weeks ago about how people think of black people in this country, and that's not necessarily a small group of people that think that way, then sadly it's a very real issue, and I can understand why it's got headline attention. That would be my kind of takeaway on this. Anybody got any final thoughts? Otherwise, I guess we should probably close.
Sorry, it's me again. I was just going to say that I think that Martin missed a very kind of like a perfect opportunity there, really, as editor, as someone that was writing a forward to sort of address this issue, really. And I'm sure he's kicking himself for that now, but to just simply shrug it off and go, well, I'm in my 70s and I'm white and middle class, didn't know any difference, is kind of, you know, I've met him a couple of times, you know, and I think what the foundation does is great, and I think the archives there and the staff do a great job, but, you know, he has got a team around him, and he could well have asked them to look it over and say, look, I am white, middle class, 70s, I don't really know what I'm doing. Can someone else
the only thing I would say to that, Gem, the only thing I'd say to that, Gem, and I'm not going to pretend everything I've done photographically is good over the last 50 years of my life. In fact, I've shown some images recently to groups that I'm not particularly proud of, but I've shown them for a reason. But if I was as tone deaf as that, I'd go put my head in a bucket of water and not come out for a while.
Oh, precisely.
He's
excuse me. What sort of response would we have preferred to have seen from Martin Parr, given that he's a 70-year-old father, middle class, white person, suddenly having to deal with the realities of very radical racial politics in Bristol?
Well, let me put that into perspective. I am a 70-year-old white middle-class person that lives just outside Bath, which is probably even more middle-class than Bristol, and probably even less black than Bristol. So actually, why the fuck am I caring about this? The answer is because I care. And the answer to Martin Parr is he actually doesn't care.
No.
I mean, I'll probably be stronger on him now than I've been for the whole presentation, right?
But you could also say that about the group that's around him. It'd be interesting to look at what stereotypes, ABC, age, and so on, are the group around him advising him. So he may have turned around to say, we don't know, to his advisors, to his people that work with him every day, you know, oh, well, we'll just leave it alone and so on. Oh, no, we've got to respond to it. And what advice has he been given? So, and that's not defending him. It's the environment he lives in.
But he does live in Bristol.
Guys, come on. I mean, I used to, some of you know, I used to run fairly large organizations. If something like this come up, I would never have been allowed to defend myself by saying I wasn't advised very well. I'm sorry, I wouldn't. I would have been fired by my bosses in the States if I'd made a mistake, because the boss is the boss, right? Martin Parr is the name on the door. Martin Parr signed the book. Martin Parr gets his £1,000. Martin Parr was the editor on the book. He was the one that didn't respond to this when it first came up as an issue. He was the one that didn't do anything about it when he published the edition. He was the one that still apparently is claiming he's just an old guy that can't figure stuff out. So at the end of the day, I really don't have too much sympathy for Martin Parr in this.
He doesn't need sympathy, Mick. But my thinking is that take into account, I've been to the gallery, I've seen the people who work for him. They're young, they're in the 20s, they're all male, they're all white. The ones I saw were. And don't fall into this trap of thinking that because they've muffled things a bit, or maybe didn't jump up when they're supposed to jump up, or anything else. The fact is, the political tensions around this are real, and the tensions are only increasing. And a lot of people are unsure of what they should say. A lot of people
John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm a product of the 1960s. The tensions were real in the 60s. I went on marches in the 60s.
Yes,
right?
quite aware of this.
I absolutely do not buy for a second that this is a new issue because some guys chucked a statue into a river 3 weeks ago. I just
I'm not suggesting that, but it's a different time, Mick, regardless of the issues being the same. And like I said earlier, things are not getting better, they're getting worse.
Well, sadly, I
know
agree with that. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. And I'm sorry, John, I'm not really on your case. It's just that I just feel quite strongly on this. And I'm sorry, I said I was going to finish, but I guess I'm not. But I feel quite strongly that if you're a public figure, then you have certain responsibilities. And I think that when I was running businesses, I had public figure responsibilities inside a certain sphere of influence, right? Nothing to do with photography, all about business. Martin Parr is a well-respected photographer. Paul Halliday is a well-respected leader of actually probably the UK's leading photography MA program, truthfully, even though we just finished at Falmouth. But and these guys are all duking it out. And somehow they just don't seem to be dealing with the core issues in all of this in some sensible way. And I think that is truly disappointing.
Parr's first letter to Baptiste is telling. I think you quoted the second, but the first one starts off with, I think it's you who started the protest, and he clearly knows it's not. Yeah. But that's the story, so he's just going with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, I hope people have found this interesting. I hope the people from Mark's group who maybe aren't used to how I talk about these things find it also interesting. I wasn't too much chat today. I know I chatted far too long a couple of weeks ago. And I really appreciate everybody coming.
I find a lot of time talking or listening to you, Mike, it actually provokes thoughts in myself as a person, as a character, in addition to my photography. So I'd like to thank you for opening that discussion within myself.
I appreciate that, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Round of applause for Mike.
Thank you. Hey, Dennis, maybe we can make connections separately because I'm still interested in following up some research on this.
Sure. My email's on the chat, so
yeah, I've sent you some social media requests, Dennis. So I'd love to follow this further academically.
Oh, somehow I've just lost my screen. Sorry, I lost my screen here. I don't know what happened.
Mick, I'll save the entire chat and send it to you as a file.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thanks very much, guys. And if anybody's got any follow-up questions, just send me a message or so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mick, for that. That was great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Right.